Lied Can Fly, podcast for contemporary art song. Hello and a warm welcome to Lied Can Fly. My name is Sabine Bergk. I created this podcast to give contemporary art song a platform in the internet, and I'm very, very blessed and I feel very thrilled that we've got James Gilchrist and Nathan Williamson as a guest today. Hello, James and Nathan.
Hello. It's very, very good to be with you.
Good to see you. Good morning.
Good morning. I will present you a little bit, even though maybe the English audience might know you, but the German audience might need some introduction. I try to keep it short because I want you guys to talk, not me. James Gilchrist is a wonderful and warm-hearted tenor with a huge career. At the moment, he is the chairman of the Association of English Singers and Speakers, and together with Nathan, they are doing a wonderful project called The Art of British Song, recording CDs on 100 years of British song, and they've done already 3 volumes on British art song, so a wonderful and very, very important project. James has been celebrating his 25 years of collaboration with the pianist Anna Tilbrook, and they recorded many, many Lieder CDs and have many interesting composers to be heard by a huge and wide audience. And of course, there is a whole biography to read, getting started as a chorister in New College, Oxford, then being a member of the King's College Choir in Cambridge, and having worked with conductors as Sir John Eliot Gardiner, Sir Roger Norrington, Richard Hickox, and many, many others. He's been touring around the world as a very highly regarded Bach singer and Baroque singer, and he worked with the San Francisco Symphony, the Stuttgart Bach Academy, the Basel Chamber Orchestra, the Bach Collegium in Japan, the Opera di Roma, a huge biography. And I just have to keep it short because we're talking about a very interesting English composer today, but it is such a wonderful career. And I asked one of my interview guests, Christophe Brigadier, if he knows James as a dear colleague. And sometimes I ask some interview guests to write something nice for the others, and so he wrote something and I translated it. So James, I'm having a little present for you. I will read it in German first and then in my own English translation. James Gilchrist ist ein wunderbarer Sängerkollege und dazu noch ein reizender Mensch ohne Star-Attitüde. Als ich 2012 zum ersten Mal Bachs Johannespassion dirigierte, war er auf der sehr langen Tournee einer der Tenöre, denen ich die Evangelistenpartie anvertraut habe. Das gleiche tat ich dann 3 Jahre später auf meiner Tournee mit der Matthäus-Passion. James ist ein sehr expressiver Sänger, der aufgrund seiner Sprachbehandlung prädestiniert ist für barocke Musik, aber aus dem gleichen Grund auch für das Liedrepertoire. Es ist nicht verwunderlich, dass er auch auf diesem Gebiet eine exzeptionelle Erscheinung ist. Herzliche Grüße, Christoph. James Gilchrist is a wonderful singer and colleague, and on top of this, an affectionate person without a star attitude. When I conducted Bach's St. John Passion for the first time in 2012, he was one of the tenors I confided the evangelist part. 3 years later, I did the same with the St. Matthew Passion. James is a very expressive singer who is, because of his sensitivity with words, predestined for Baroque music and for the same reason for the lead repertoire. It is not surprising that he's an exceptional personality in this field as well. With warm wishes, Christoph. So that's a little present.
Well, thank you. I'm blushing. That's very, very kind of you. Christoph, did start. He did a little bit of conducting, which he'd never done before, and I think he was feeling quite anxious about it. And I was very touched that he asked me to do the evangelist in his Johannes Passion, because to get an Englishman to sing such a work of German literature is great. But of course, I work in German a lot. One has to, really. And it's something I'd love to talk about is the language problem or the language delight about where each of us comes from, and particularly in the Lied repertoire. I'd love to discuss that a little further if possible.
Yeah, I'd like to as well. So now we go to Nathan. Nathan Williamson is a pianist, a composer, and artistic director. At the moment, he's artistic director of the Southwold Music Trust in Suffolk. And as a composer, he's been writing an opera, piano works, string quartets, chamber music, and also lieder. And he's working in local communities with amateurs and youth. That is something that also Judith Weir is doing a lot. And I feel that maybe in your country, it is more highly regarded than in our country. I just know that Lars Vogt, a wonderful pianist who died already, did Rhapsody in school as a project with schools. But I feel that in the UK, there's a lot of activity from highly professionals with young people and also in care homes. And I read that James also works for a Mind Song charity in Gloucestershire with music therapy. So you're both active in the social sector with music as well, which is just wonderful. And Nathan recorded with James this great project, 100 Years of British Song, British Art Song, and also creates as an artistic director projects like the songbook to ask our own society and century what is song going to be in the 21st century, in a collaboration of teamwork and improvisation, and it all sounds so right and wonderful. And I just have to tell you both that in my research I found that two French musicologists, Pierre Barbier and France Vernier, created a huge project, Histoire de France par les chansons, the history of France by song, an anthology of 750 years of French song, where they collected the political, the family song, the song of the chanson de salon, and erotic song, and the song de révolte. So there was a huge project in France as well to even explain the history of a country by song. And I feel that you both do a little bit the same. You get so deep into British art song, and maybe one day we can understand the country in a different way and the history if we just follow this.
That's a wonderful project. I'd love to hear more about that. Maybe you could share me a link or something later. English song is interesting in that it's only really would be strongly defined as a tradition of art song in the very distant past, in the Elizabethan and very early Baroque era, and then perhaps in the 20th century. And there was a big gap in between. Not that composers weren't writing vocal works in English, but they probably wouldn't be so much considered song. More theatre was much more the British tradition. I speak very generally, of course, but we worked on our project mainly going back to roughly about the time of the First World War and subsequently that 100 years, often known as the sort of British musical Renaissance, is often so described. But the overall history of a country and a culture told through song would be a fascinating history, and I'm very interested in that French project on that.
Yeah, I will send you the link.
I've not just a couple of CDs though.
Yeah, and today we're talking about a composer that I discovered by you both, Thomas Pitfield. And when I started to listen to his music, I said immediately, I want to talk about this music. It is, to me, set in such a delicate way and so interesting. And last year has been some kind of Thomas Pitfield year. So I found out that there was a catalogue came out, Endless Fascination, the Life and Work of Thomas Pitfield by Rosemary Furman and John Turner.
Right.
And with Divine Art Records, there has been 3 CDs on Thomas Pitfield. So one about the songs, one about friends and contemporaries, and one about string chamber music. And I've also found that Nathan has been recording violin sonatas of Thomas Pitfield. How did that come? Did you know him for a long time? Is he very well known in England?
Well, no, I think is the short answer. I think probably, I'm not sure of when James first heard of him, but I think certain our collaboration with his work came through my connection with this chap, John Turner, who was one of the authors of the book. And that book is a fascinating, just very briefly, is a fascinating work. It's a very substantial work, but that's for three main reasons. And that Pitfield was a composer, but he was also a very fine writer and also a very fine artist. And so the work in itself is sort of three biographies of three different creative strands. So it is a fairly large work, but a big proportion of it is obviously about his composing and his music. And it is, as a composer, I think is probably most highly regarded today. But John Turner knew him very well and is a trustee of the Thomas Pitfield Trust, which promotes his work. And it's really John who's driven forward a lot of these projects. And last year, you're correct, there was a particular focus on Pitfield's work with the launch of the book and then the various CDs. There's actually another one, which this literally arrived on my doorstep just a few days ago.
That's magic.
Thomas Pitfield orchestral music. This is not a project that James or I were involved in, but it includes a sinfonietta and a couple of works for violin and orchestra and some other incidental pieces for strings and other things. So that's a recent addition. But James and I had, I think, performed some of his songs in connection with 100 Years of British Song, although we didn't record him on those three CDs originally. But then as we looked into it more, his repertoire is absolutely vast. He wrote an enormous amount of music. They're mostly very short pieces, but of course, when you're dealing with songs, there are several hundred songs, but they're very, very diverse. They range from quite difficult and complex and profound art song right through to arrangements of folk songs and of children's songs and music not only for children to listen to, but also for children to sing. Some of them are very, very simple and they're aimed at the younger performer as well as at the younger audience. So we didn't really know quite how to get a handle on this because it was such a sort of unwieldy and enormous thing. And we wanted to bring it to one disc. So with John's advice, James and I came up with the repertoire that we did on the CD, which is most of his quote unquote art song, but with also some other incidental and interesting things. And one of the pieces, which I'll just finish with mentioning, is this fascinating melodrama called Skeleton Bride, when James has to narrate a poem over what is basically a very sophisticated piano piece with a poem narrated over the top. And that has drawn an enormous amount of attention. It's really very special. And you know, we've since been looking into the repertoire for that spoken voice and musical accompaniment, and it's not a large repertoire that does that, but it is the Pitfield work is certainly one of the finest examples of that which I've ever encountered, and I think it's really a very special discovery.
I got to present Thomas Pitfield for my audience a little bit. So he was born in Bolton in 1903 and he lived until 1999. He was a composer but also an autodidact. And John Turner described him as a composer, artist, author, poet, designer, craftsman, woodcarver, calligrapher, vegetarian, and pacifist. I apologize for my English all the time, but I try my very best. So he had quite a difficult life. He studied at the Royal Manchester College of Music, but only for 1 year composition with Thomas Cayley. And then he didn't have a family that was really protecting him or helping him. So it's a difficult start. And he also studied at the Bolton School of Art. So that's why he is also a very trained visual artist. And on the 3 CDs at Divine Art Records, you see a wonderful picture of him, and it tells also, to me, it tells a lot about his way of composing, because the lines are very reduced and he's very careful with shadows and with empty spaces, and that's for me what makes the music so interesting. I come to that later, but I have some kind of very good feeling for space and for breath and for shadows and light, and it's never packed too full. So that what makes it sing naturally. So he was also a pacifist. My sympathy was immediately there. He didn't want to go to war, and he got through it, so he could stay at home and teach. And He wrote more than 150 songs, and the variety is huge, as you said, from folk songs to art songs to Christmas lullabies. What I found in your collection, I would like to know if you went through all the 150 songs, or how did you make your choice? It must have been a crazy bunch of work. But what I found, there's a lot of, as you talked about the Skeleton Bride, there's a lot of shadow work in it, like with the Skeleton Bride, with shapes, with disembodied spectral appearances, with ghosts. There's also a piece called Shadow March, and today I picked two songs because I like the music so much that I thought we have to listen to two. One is Lingering Music in the second setting, and at the end of the podcast I want to go to Birds About the Morning Air just at the end. So did you compose the album a little bit like a visual artist as well with the colors?
Well,
Jane.
I'll answer that a little bit. You asked how we came across the songs, and Nathan's quite right that I hadn't really heard of Thomas Pitfield until Nathan and I started working at his songs. And the answer to your question about how we chose what to do, we didn't go through every song that he wrote by any means. There is one published volume of his songs from which we chose the vast majority of what we performed, and actually it's a very fine collection, and it's full of Thomas Pitfield's own line drawings and woodcuts and so on, and I think that it's rather a beautiful piece of work, the actual the book. And then we included some children's songs and The Skeleton Bride that are not included in this volume. But I think we tried to sort of make the disc have some sort of shape as a whole performance. So the children's songs exist sort of in their own little moment in the disc. And then there's an area of the disc where we try to follow the seasons of the year, so through spring and summer and autumn and winter and so on. Then there's a section of folk songs. And indeed, you're absolutely right to pick up on some of these more spectral, ghostly songs, which does seem to be a fascination of his. And we put those together. And one of the other interesting things that Pitfield has done is to set his own poetry. So he was quite a fine poet. And I think I don't know of a great many composers who do this. Most composers who write songs, and I would love to talk about that, tend to set other poets because they're inspired by something in the poem which causes them to want to write, to embellish it or to explore the poem through the medium of music. And I think Pitfield is unusual in wanting to set his own poems. And I think that does make it a very interesting aspect to his work, because I think, when you read a poem, you think the poet wants to say something, and then often when a composer sets that poetry, they're finding one facet of the poem or one aspect of it and embellishing that, and it's very much a different person's viewpoint. Whereas, of course, when you have the same person writing the words and the music, it's not like that. There's a sort of impulse that has created both things. But what I'm really interested, you're going to play Lingering Music, one of the settings that he made, and you correctly pointed out that he made two settings of it. And quite interestingly, these are quite different. And I think it's fascinating that there's somebody can write a poem and they themselves can find musical inspiration in two slightly different ways from their own poem. And I find that really fascinating.
Just going to say, I'm curious as to whether he wrote the poetry as a poem and then decided to set it later, or whether it was conceived as the same thing. And I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. He was a very productive person. He didn't sort of dwell or sort of talk about himself and his own creative process very much. He just sort of would write these things, or probably just in a very short space of time, and move on to the next thing. And as Jane says, with these two settings, and that's not the only song he set twice. If he didn't, perhaps whether he felt that there was something not quite right about the first one, he wasn't going to change it. It's just it's the way it is. If you want to do something different, then just do it again, do it in a different way. But whether it was a poem that he then was drawn to set, or whether he wrote them as a song, like a singer-songwriter, I don't know. But it is a fascinating creative process that he went through.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
find your comment there, Nathan, about singer-songwriter is very, very pertinent because we're talking about art song, the lied and the chanson and English song and all the rest of it as a sort of separate entity. And in this area, it is rare for people to set their own poems. But in more popular genres, it's almost unheard of to do anything else. It's very rare that you get somebody who is specifically a lyricist for popular music. It's often the one artist who comes up both with the music and with the words. And I find this really an interesting divide. And Pitfield, to some extent, manages to cross it.
exactly. That's why I chose. There are two other art songs. To me, they are masterworks. One is The Unfulfilled, and the other one is The Wagon of Life. And they're very strong and very virtuose. But I picked those where the poem is from his own feather because I wanted this connection. And in the classical music world, it is not very well regarded if you write a poem and you make the composition. So it's this very specified. Everybody is a specialist. And in my podcast, I also made an interview with a singer-songwriter who is teaching a lot of songwriting in Germany, in Mannheim, and to point out the difference that maybe it is possible we have to be more free, and that's how creativity can flow. That also, I know a poet in Germany who became a composer now, and he's with Universal Music now. But he's a wonderful poet as well, and he works also with composers. But somehow he started composing himself, and that's a little bit how I started this podcast as well, because I've been writing with composers for 15 years, art songs, and I thought it's a bit weird to show my own stuff, but in pop music they do it all the time. Why shouldn't I? They do it all the time, and why should I wait longer than 15 years, maybe 30 years, until I can show one of my little songs? And it was just about playing them, and from the first day we had 300 listeners, and then at the moment I have no time for writing anymore because the podcast is eating me. But it was a very natural impulse, and I felt that in the classical world sometimes there's a bit of arrogance and very specialist people, and I thought pop music is more free, and singer-songwriters also the part of the chanson. I interviewed a German chanson writer who's writing the poem and setting it into the music, and he's also playing the piano. So that's very normal. And yeah, should we listen to this second version of Lingering Music?
That's good.
Over the dusking earth, all voices sweet, soft as the music tread of phantom feet, quiet as a thought might linger through still evening air, or see lips whisper a wordless prayer. So music faded, comes ghost-like back to trace its former strains about the vacant place.
This was Lingering Music by Thomas Pitfield in the second version, after a poem by Thomas Pitfield. with James Gilchrist and Nathan Williamson.
Lingering Music, the words and music by Thomas Pitfield. Over the dusking earth fall voices sweet, soft as the muted tread of phantom feet. Quiet as a thought might linger through still evening air, or sealed lips whisper a wordless prayer. So music faded comes ghost-like back to trace its former strayings about the vacant place.
Oh, thank you, James. I love this vacant place in the end.
Yeah.
There's something in the song to me that starts to die in our time. That's this lingering and straying, this afternoon feeling of having time for thoughts and for creation and just for being. And I feel that in this poem there's this atmosphere of lingering, and the formless is getting into form, and to fill this vacant place with some kind of shadows before we die. And everybody's so busy nowadays that there's not much time left like that. So to me, this special poem is a treasury.
This is very much what I feel about one of my personal favourites, which is The Winter Evening at Dunham Park, which I think is an absolutely magical song. And what I find so touching and moving about this song, I mean, again, that is also a poem by Pitfield, is this sense of place. And James and I have talked about this a lot, how the artist is responding to a certain place, a certain time of day, as you've just alluded, often a dusky or a slightly shadowy one, as we've mentioned. But he describes it very evocatively and very personally, but it's never about himself. I mean, a lot of romantic poets, and there is a tradition of this in romantic poetry, is you respond to nature around you in that it reflects your own feelings. So, you know, in wintertime, you feel very miserable, and the frozen earth reflects my frozen heart and all this kind of stuff. And obviously, when spring comes, we all fall in love again, and our lives begin again, etc. And that, of course, that's very powerful and wonderful in its own way. Pitfield has somehow managed to find a way to reflect nature with great clarity, with great tenderness and evocation, but he doesn't reflect it in a self-indulgent sort of way. He doesn't start talking about his own feelings and his own problems or joys, for that matter. And I find that incredibly touching. And it's interesting that with Dunham Park, and again, you hinted at this before with the connection between his musical lines and the lines of his drawing and paintings, which are quite often quite sparse. In the songbook, there is also a picture of Dunham Park. So you've got a picture and a poem and a song. And so, you know, you've kind of got the full house there. And it is that atmosphere that he manages to create. And it's so tender and touching and personal, but never just purely. You don't have to see the thing from the poet's point of view. He just relates it to you and explains, and then that's it. There's no great philosophical conclusion or life-changing sort of eureka moment or anything like that. It's just that's just it, and he leaves it, and you make of it what you will. I think it's really quite special, quite wonderful.
Now it's time for a little ad. The Lead Can Fly podcast is proudly supported by the First Inversion family of labels: Divine Art Métier, Athenie, Diversions and Echozone. From early music to today's most cutting edge, find your next favorite album at first-inversion.com/recordings. After today's episode, explore the music of Thomas Pitfield at first-inversion.com/Pitfield and save 20% with code LEADER. Yeah, I was very close to picking In Winter Evening, Dunham Park, because it is just a wonderful song, and I really recommend the CD. And it's the first time that you are able to listen to the songs of Thomas Pitfield. So I was very tempted to pick The Winter Evening, Dunham Park, because I felt the English landscape was so omnipresent, but then I decided to take this lingering music because of the second setting. And I think it's interesting because the first setting, I feel a lot of shadowy moves, but the second one is like, for me, is on top of this. It is, I can't explain it with my English. There are so many harmonic changes. It is so really lingering from here to there. And it at the end is just brilliant and so pure and full of joy as well. So it's lighter but more complex. How do you feel about this second version?
I agree with your analysis. I think that's very, very perceptive, and I think anybody who listens to these two pieces will come up upon a different feeling that they feel for each of them, and I find that fascinating, as I said earlier. But I love there is definitely a sense of decay and loss that seems to be pertaining. But I agree that the second setting does seem to end in a more kind of upbeat way. Well, not quite upbeat, but more resigned, perhaps, more kind of able to bear. And yeah, I love your interpretation of it.
They're very difficult to play. I found it quite quixotic, this music, and not very easy to sort of get into. You know, it's very sparse. It's quite minimalist, really, and one looks at some of the other songs in the volume, and knowing some other of Pitfield's work, it can be very vibrant and expressive, and like some of the folk song settings, they have this sort of more apparent energy, and then suddenly this kind of very still, one has to be quite objective about it, and it's not an easy thing to bring off. You just have to sort of let it speak for itself, and you there's not really an awful lot you sort of, as the performer, you can't sort of make it your own or do, you know, you just interpret and play it in a very simple way. But I think that in a sense is quite difficult to do.
And Nathan, you're taking yourself back for when you play, so you play in a very decent way. That's so wonderful, because at the same time you play in a crystal clear way that the colors can come through, and not putting too much identity or personality into it works so well with this kind of poetry and the way the music is set. It is, I think, just the perfect way of interpretation, so that you can really get into the song and into the atmosphere of the song. And also James, when he's singing, I feel there's so much warmth in it, and also the ability to wander. And sometimes just a tone or a note that is coming is completely felt through. So it is very wonderful to listen to this recording.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about Nathan's accompaniment. Well, it's a terrible word to call it accompany. I always think that work for voice and piano should really be, you know, considered as being a work of chamber music. You know, that the piano, you know, you go back through history and you think of all the composers, I mean, almost everybody since about 1800 who one thinks of as a composer has written stuff for voice and piano. And a great many of them were primarily pianists. And you think of the great writers like Schubert and Schumann, they would have played their own work. And I think a lot of the emotional heart of a work is really in the piano writing. And that's where the reflection occurs, and that's where the kind of the heart of the composer is felt. I think a lot of composers are primarily pianists, not all by any means. But
well, Pitfield wasn't, funnily enough.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. But I do think that is the heart sometimes of a work for voice and piano.
I think Pitfield was you know, I'm sure he was a competent keyboard player. I'm sure he learned more than a few chords, put it that way. But his piano writing is not a little idiosyncratic in places. But on the other hand, occasionally he does very, very pianistic things. Whether he did that himself or he took advice, I mean, there are some moments sort of these sort of flourishes, which is a very, very physical pianistic effect, not just a compositional one. But I you know, again, not to repeat ourselves, but I think really, as you've said, you paid tribute to James's emphasis on the text and clarity of the text. That really he is looking at these songs from a poet's point of view, and of course it's a combination. But what James does so well is he tells the story of whatever he is singing, and although there is not so much of a narrative in these songs as we talked about, it's sort of more focused on a kind of circular, just a moment in time. And actually that then another one that always springs to mind is the song In an Old Country Church. And He just captured that moment. Just one. It could be 5 minutes, or it could be 10 minutes. Could be one split second when you just have that shudder of some sort of magical spiritual feeling, or however you wish to describe it. In an old, it could be in an old building, or it could be, obviously in a sacred place like a church. And he doesn't. Nothing happens. Nothing happens in any of these songs, really. I mean, that's not entirely true, but more or less, there's very little story or narrative or even individual characters. Just this personal reflection on wherever he is and whatever he is at the time. But the way he combines the voice and the piano is very equal. The atmosphere of the piano and the context, a bit like a canvas for a painter, and then obviously the specific words that James sings. So I'm glad. I'm obviously very, very pleased that that you feel it's come over well, because although the songs are in many ways very simple, they're not simplistic, and they're certainly not easy. They're certainly not easy to bring off and to perform. And I'm very pleased it came over, because we worked pretty hard on them.
And how was it for you, Nathan, the difference between the first and the second setting? I felt that the second setting there's more complex movement in the piano.
Yeah, I prefer the second one, I have to say. But then again, that's just today. Tomorrow, another.
Yeah.
I find both of those, but both of those songs, as I mentioned before, it's really just the objective nature of them. There's some personal sort of chord spacings and things in the first one which I find quite difficult. Personally, it's just the shape of my hand. That's nothing specific to the song. But I mean, these things will make a little difference to how you remember and how you recall the process of performing them. I find the simplicity of them very difficult. In some of you mentioned the Pushkin settings, which were an unusual in this context, in that they're not by Pitfield. The words are not by Pitfield. They were actually translated from Pushkin by his wife, who was a native Russian speaker. She was English, but she was brought up in Russia. And those are much more overtly sort of romantic, and they have a sort of a Russian sort of feel, if that's, and I use that term to imply a sort of deep romanticism. There's also quite a sort of neoclassical kind of caricature-y sort of Prokofievian thing about it as well. But those songs, you can sort of see exactly what he's aiming for. They're quite orchestral. It's this minimalist thing, which, I think it works. I think I do it quite well. But especially when you're creating a background for a poem to emerge, you sort of want to go with the shape of the words or do something. But it's like, actually, no, I don't. I mustn't do that. It speaks for itself. That can be very difficult to do in performance.
I can imagine. I just noted some verses of the poem By the Dee at Night, and they just came into my... I just had to write them down, and I really loved those verses. Sounds become disembodied, shapes spectral, grey sky, grey sand, grey silence.
Yeah.
I ruined this one.
No, you did.
So, but I loved it because suddenly it became music with grey sky, grey sand, grey silence. It was like different chords, harmonies of music and colors, and very pure, just with a little break in between. So like a painting. And but the other song we are going to hear, it's more like a little folk song, but to me, I just wrote down just right. It felt just right, and that's why I want to finish this podcast with this song called Birds About the Morning Air, because it's so full of happiness and splendor and a little bit of folk song, and the poem is so wonderful as well. James, would you like to read the poem to us?
I'd be delighted to. I will certainly redo that. I mean, just before we leave, what I'm so struck, Sabine, by the whole of this podcast is that you, as a native German speaker, are expanding your wish and your horizons beyond work in the German language. And I think there's a terrible danger with song, because it's so rooted in poetry and so rooted in language, that each nation can sort of claim its own song and sort of become rather jealous of it. And the whole art form can become a little bit ghettoized, so that it becomes that English people only sing English song, and German speakers only sing German song, and French singers only sing French song. And to my mind, this is a huge mistake. I love it when I hear people, because, and I tell you why I find it a huge mistake, is because we've been discussing this morning what Nathan and I and you feel about the poems. And you, Sabina, have come up with new ideas about this poetry, which I hadn't really thought about, that you've come at it with a slightly different perspective. And I love that. And I think when we come from different cultures, we can come across the same work of art and shine a slightly different light upon it. And I think this is incredibly powerful. I mean, I sing a lot of German Lieder, and I suspect that my performance of Die Schöne Müllerin is ever so slightly different to a native German speaker's. And I may be sing it with a slight accent, but I hope that I nevertheless tell the story and shine a slightly new light on it. And I would love it to hear German natives sing English song. And I know there are a few who do, and it's one. In fact, Christophe Prégardien is one of them. I've heard him sing Benjamin Britten's Winter Words, and it was fantastic. It was quite unlike any English singer singing it, and I loved it. And I just think you wouldn't go to a string quartet made of, French players and say they're only allowed to play French music. They may have something special to say about French music, but I want to hear them play Czech music. I want to hear them play German music. I want them to hear them play English music. And I think it's just wonderful that you are making this podcast that spreads the word for art song in general. And I very much hope that people for whom English is not their native language can feel that they have something to say in English song. I think it's a glorious thing that you're doing, and I applaud it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you know what? Last year in the summer, I was looking desperately for a recording, and I found a French label, and they made a disc on English art song, linked to Virginia Woolf. And I was doing an episode on Ethel Smythe. And a friend of mine wrote a big book about Debussy and Ethel Smythe. So we did the interview together, and we were looking for a wonderful recording. And I thought, it's not possible. We can't find a really good professional recording. And somehow the CD just came new to the market and plopped by some ghost onto my screen. And I asked them, Octave Records, and they even named the CD after Virginia Woolf, Un lieu à soi. And they won the golden palm last year with that record on English music.
Yeah.
And another guest of my podcast, Anastasia Krishutina, just did the Hermit songs, a CD with the Hermit songs this year.
Wonderful.
There are so many crossroads, but nobody knows what the other is doing, and mostly the art song is a bit trapped in the universities. And as I always feel like a female Taugenichts outside of the university, I'm just writing art song to save my own soul for 50 years.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the Hermit songs, because, of course, as an English speaker, I'm well aware that although within England there is a great deal of music going on to do with art song, of course, it's not, although the word English sort of makes you think of England, it is nevertheless the case that, of course, English is widely spoken across the globe. And there's plenty. I mean, Samuel Barber, of course, was an American, and there's great American art song, and there's art song from the other parts of the British Isles and from Australia and South Africa, and all of this using the English language. And I think, partly with my association of English singing and speaking hat on, I'm really keen to explore the fact that English as a language in song and speech is used across the globe. Anyway,
we hope that maybe some German pianists and singers will explore Thomas Pitfield now, or maybe some English pianists and singers will get to know Wilhelm Killmeyer, who will celebrate his birthday next year, his 100th birthday, and a wonderful composer who also wrote his own limericks as Thomas Pitfield. And there's plenty of limericks by Wilhelm Killmeyer as well, with a lot of humor. And Killmeyer has been writing lied when nobody of the avant-garde was interested in piano and voice. So he was a very, you say monolith or monolith in
Monolith.
his
Yeah.
own way of writing and not caring what the others are doing, but at the same time having a lot of composers as Wolfgang Rehm for friends, so he wasn't alone. But for the end, I picked this Birds About the Morning Air because to me it spreads so much happiness. What a song is, just being in the air and we can sing it, and that is something that I also enjoy so much.
Yes, let me read the poem for you. So it's a poem, again, by the composer Thomas Pitfield. Birds about the morning air squander music everywhere, caring not if you or I keep their songs or let them die, or let them die. But the songs I careless make, not so careless I forsake, hoping that my songs will be cherished in your memory, in your memory.
Oh, thank you so much. Shall we listen to it now?
Please.
Birds about the morning air squander music everywhere, caring not if you or I keep their songs or let them die, or let them die. But the songs I careless make, not so careless I forsake, hoping that my songs will be cherished in your memory, in your memory.
This was Birds About the Morning Air by Thomas Pitfield with James Gilchrist and Nathan Williamson. Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, James, for being my guest today. I think we should do some more interviews because it seems to be endless, and I really want to know more of your project and what you're doing with 100 Years of British Art Song, and I'm very curious, and it's just wonderful that we got in contact, and I hope that many people will be able to buy the CD of Thomas Pitfield and be curious, and that curiosity might be what drives us and not depression.
Thank you. Well, Sabine, it's been a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very, very much for taking the time to get in touch with me and Nathan.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And we'd certainly be very happy to talk about other composers and more song of any type.
This was Lead Can Fly with James Gilchrist and Nathan Williamson. Thank you for listening and hope you join us next time.